The man from the SUV didn't speak right away. Instead, he slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes that scanned the group like he was memorizing every face. Then finally, he spoke. "James," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You all right?" James gave a slow nod. "I'm fine, son, just having a chat with these gentlemen." The way he said gentlemen made the bikers tense up. It was subtle, but they could feel the shift in the air. The easy confidence they had just moments ago was slipping. The man in black took a step forward, hands relaxed at his sides, but carrying an undeniable weight. One of the bikers, the bearded one, tried to regain control of the situation. "Hey man, we were just joking around," he said, forcing a smirk. "Didn't mean nothing by it." The man in black tilted his head slightly. "That's so." He glanced at James, as if reading the truth from his face. Then he turned back to them. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were trying to intimidate an 85-year-old man." His tone was calm, but there was something behind it, something that made the bikers shift uncomfortably. Scarface crossed his arms, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "Look, buddy, we don't want trouble. We were just." The man in black held up a hand, cutting him off. "See, that's the thing," he said. "Trouble has a funny way of finding people who go looking for it." The bikers weren't sure what to do. They have faced fights before, dealt with tough guys in bars and back alleys. But this felt different. This man wasn't just some random stranger stepping in. He carried himself like someone who had seen things, handled things. James finally spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You boys ever hear the name Marcus Carter?" The silence that followed was deafening. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. Because that name, it meant something. And suddenly, they weren't so sure they wanted to be standing there anymore. The name hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and full of something the bikers weren't ready to face. Scarface narrowed his eyes, his confidence faltering for the first time. "Marcus Carter," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a mix of uncertainty and recognition. James leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his cane. "That's right," he said. "And I'd say you got about 5 seconds to decide if you want to keep testing your luck tonight." The man in black, Marcus, didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence alone enough to make the air feel thicker. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. In fact, they weren't saying much at all. Because now, pieces of a puzzle were snapping into place. They had heard the name before. Some of them had even whispered it in the right circles, the kinds of places where reputations carried more weight than fists. Marcus Carter wasn't just some guy stepping out of an SUV. He was someone you didn't cross. Someone who had a history. A long unspoken history that made even the toughest men think twice. Bearded guy swallowed hard, his bravado all but gone. "Look, man," he started, his voice softer now, more careful. "We didn't know who he was. We didn't mean anything by it." Marcus took another step forward, slow and deliberate. "But you did mean something by it," he said. "Because men like you always do. You pick your targets. You look for the ones you think won't fight back. Ain't that right?" Nobody answered. Scarface clenched his jaw, glancing at his crew as if searching for a way out of this. The tension was suffocating now, pressing down on them with every second that passed. James watched them closely, his expression unreadable. He had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that crept in when men realized they weren't the ones in control anymore. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Now here's the part where you tell me you didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "That you were just joking around. That you didn't think it would go this far." Scarface exhaled sharply, shifting on his feet. We. Before he could finish, another car pulled up. This one was different. Sleek, dark, with tinted windows that gave nothing away. The bikers turned their heads, their unease spiking even higher. James let a small smile play at the corner of his lips. "Well now," he said, his voice almost amused. "Looks like you boys are about to learn a real lesson in respect." The bikers stood frozen as the car door clicked open. The night wasn't over yet, and something told them it was about to take a turn they weren't ready for. The second car sat there, engine humming low, like it was waiting for the right moment to pounce. The bikers stiffened, their unease now turning into something closer to fear. They had no idea who was inside, but they knew enough to realize this was no coincidence. The old man sat quietly on the worn-down bench outside the small-town diner, sipping his coffee and watching the world go by. His name was James Carter, an 85-year-old veteran who had seen more in his lifetime than most could ever imagine. He had served his country with honor, built a life through hard work, and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. But today, as the rumble of motorcycles filled the air, something told him this afternoon would be different. The bikers rolled in like a storm, their leather jackets and roaring engines demanding attention. There were 5 of them, loud, rough, and looking for trouble. At first, James didn't pay them much mind. He had dealt with men like this before, men who mistook kindness for weakness. But when they started making crude jokes and laughing at him, he knew this wasn't just a passing encounter. One of them, a tall guy with a jagged scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Hey, old man," he sneered. "You lost or something?" His friends laughed, egging him on. James met his eyes, calm and steady, refusing to take the bait. But they weren't done. They circled him, their voices growing louder, their words sharper. "Maybe he needs help finding his way home," another one chuckled. "Or maybe he should have stayed home," another added. James took a deep breath, gripping his cane a little tighter. He had fought battles far worse than this. He had stood his ground against enemies much stronger. But there was one thing these bikers didn't know. James wasn't the kind of man to be pushed around. Instead of reacting with anger, he did something they never expected. He pulled out his old flip phone and dialed a number. The bikers exchanged confused glances. Who was he calling? A friend? The police? The phone rang once, twice, and then someone picked up. James spoke just a few words, his voice calm but firm. On the other end, silence, then a deep, knowing chuckle. The bikers had no idea what was coming next. And by the time they realized, it was already too late. The bikers stood there, smirking, waiting to see what this old man thought he was doing. James slowly closed his flip phone and set it down on the bench beside him. His face was calm, almost too calm, and that made the men uneasy. Scarface, the one who had spoken first, took a step closer, cracking his knuckles. "Who'd you call, old-timer?" "Your grandson, the cops. Think somebody's gonna come save you." The others chuckled, the sound echoing through the empty parking lot. James didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his coat and took another sip of his coffee, as if he had all the time in the world. "You boys ever hear about respect?" His voice was steady, controlled. The tallest biker, a burly guy with a thick beard, scoffed. "Respect? Man, we don't answer to nobody. Least of all some old guy sitting on a bench." He kicked a loose rock across the pavement, his impatience growing. James studied them for a moment, his deep brown eyes revealing nothing. He had seen men like this before, men who thought they were untouchable, who believed fear made them strong. But James knew better. He had spent years learning the truth about power, about what it really meant to stand tall. "You think you're the toughest thing to walk these streets, don't you?" James said, his voice just a little sharper now. Scarface smirked. I know we are. James nodded, as if considering the idea. Then, without warning, the sound of tires screeching filled the air. A black SUV turned the corner at a controlled but aggressive speed, pulling up right in front of the diner. The windows were tinted so dark that nothing inside was visible. The bikers went silent, their confidence suddenly flickering. The SUV sat there, engine humming, a presence all on its own. The bikers exchanged nervous glances. Who the hell is that? One of them muttered. James set his coffee cup down carefully, stretching his fingers over his knee. Guess you're about to find out, he said, almost to himself. The driver's door opened slowly, deliberately. A boot hit the pavement first, followed by a figure stepping out. Their posture rigid, their stance solid. The tension in the air thickened. The bikers didn't know it yet, but their night was about to take a turn they'd never forget. The SUV door swung open, and out stepped a man who moved with purpose. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in all black, boots polished, jacket crisp. Even in the dimming light of the evening, his presence demanded attention. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. Scarface took a step forward, trying to mask his sudden discomfort. Who the hell is this? He muttered under his breath. James didn't answer. He just leaned back on the bench, watching the moment unfold like he had seen it coming all along. Scarface took a half step back, shifting his weight like he was ready to run if it came to that. But Marcus didn't take his eyes off him. He hadn't moved much, but something about his posture had changed, like he was just waiting, letting the moment stretch as long as it needed to. Then the back door of the car slowly opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He looked older than Marcus, but carried the same quiet intensity. His silver hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable. But the moment his polished shoes hit the pavement, the energy in the parking lot shifted again. James smiled, tapping his cane against the ground lightly. Well, well, he murmured. Didn't expect to see you tonight. The man gave a slow nod. Figured I'd drop by. Heard there was a situation. His voice was smooth, controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence now in free fall. They had walked into something much bigger than they ever intended, and they knew it. But they still didn't understand how big. Marcus finally spoke again, his gaze locked on the group. You boys don't even know who you just messed with, do you? Bearded guy shook his head quickly. Look, The man in the suit raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Doesn't matter, he said, his tone firm but calm. What matters is how this ends. Scarface swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. We don't want any trouble. Marcus let out a short, humorless chuckle. That's funny, he said. Because 5 minutes ago, you were looking for trouble. James leaned back on the bench, watching it all unfold like he had seen this play out 100 times before. He wasn't worried, not even a little, because he knew something these bikers didn't. The man in the suit turned his gaze toward them, his expression unreadable. Here's the thing, he said. Men like you. He paused, glancing at James. You don't realize when you've crossed a line until it's too late. The bikers stood frozen, waiting for what came next. But they weren't going to like the answer. The bikers stood still, their confidence completely drained. Whatever fight they had left was slipping fast, and they knew it. The man in the suit kept his gaze locked on them, his presence alone enough to pin them in place. Marcus took a slow step forward, just enough to make them flinch. See, Marcus said, his voice even but firm, there's a lesson in all this. Respect, it's not something you take. It's something you earn. James nodded, tapping his cane lightly against the ground. "And you boys just walked into the wrong classroom." Scarface clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Marcus and the suited man, like he was trying to figure out how bad this was going to get. He took a shaky breath, then lifted his hand slightly. "Look," he said carefully, "we get it. We messed up. We didn't know who we were dealing with." The man in the suit studied him for a long moment before exhaling. "No, you didn't." He glanced at James, then back at them. "But now you do." The tension was thick, but just as it felt like something was about to snap, the suited man reached into his pocket. The bikers tensed, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small, worn-out military patch. He held it between his fingers, letting the dim parking lot light catch the edges of the fabric. James' eyes softened as he recognized it instantly. "Didn't think you still had that," he murmured. The man in the suit smiled faintly. "Some things are worth keeping." He turned his attention back to the bikers. "You ever hear of the 761st Tank Battalion?" The group said nothing. James leaned forward slightly. "First Black Armored Unit in World War II. Paved the way for men like you to even have the freedom to stand here today." The realization hit the bikers all at once. James wasn't just some old man at a diner. He was history. And Marcus, the suited man, they weren't just people he called for backup. They were family. Scarface took another step back. "We didn't know," he said quietly, his voice almost hollow. Marcus shook his head. "No, you didn't. But ignorance ain't an excuse." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then James finally broke the silence. "Here's what's gonna happen," he said. "You're gonna walk away. You're gonna think real hard about the choices you make from now on. And if I ever hear about you pulling this kind of nonsense again—" Marcus finished the sentence for him. "You won't like who shows up next time."
Scarface nodded quickly. Understood. One by one, the bikers backed away, their earlier arrogance nowhere to be found. They climbed onto their bikes, fired up their engines, and without another word, they sped off into the night. James watched them go, then reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. "Kids these days," he muttered, shaking his head. Marcus chuckled, slipping his sunglasses back on. "You're getting soft, old man." James smirked. "You say that now. But they'll remember this night for the rest of their lives." The suited man glanced at his watch. "Well, I think we've handled enough business for one evening." He turned to James. "Need a ride home?" James shook his head. "I think I'll sit here a little longer." He looked up at the stars, a knowing glint in his eyes. Let him remember who they met tonight. Marcus smiled. Fair enough. The SUV doors shut, the engine rumbled to life, and as the vehicle pulled away, James sat back on his bench, the same quiet strength in his posture as before. The night had tested him, but in the end, respect had been earned, not taken, and as the sound of distant motorcycles faded, James simply took another sip of his coffee, watching the world go by once again. The night had settled back into its usual rhythm. The hum of distant cars, the flickering neon sign of the diner, the occasional breeze that rustled the trees. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But James knew better. He had seen nights like this before, moments that seemed small but changed everything for the people involved. He sat there for a while, letting the quiet sink in. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't mind. He had all the warmth he needed. He thought about the bikers, the way their bravado had crumbled when they realized who they were dealing with. Maybe they'd go home and forget about tonight, write it off as a bad run-in. Or maybe, just maybe, they'd carry this lesson with them. James sighed, stretching his fingers over his cane. He wasn't in the business of revenge. He never had been. He had spent his life fighting battles that mattered, standing up for what was right. And tonight, he had done it again, not with fists, not with threats, but with something more powerful. A name, a presence, a reminder. The door to the diner opened, and a young waitress stepped out, her apron still tied around her waist. She looked over at him, hesitated for a moment, then walked up. "Sir," she said gently, "do you need anything? Maybe a fresh cup of coffee?" James smiled at her kindness. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I'm just enjoying the night." She nodded, shifting on her feet. I saw what happened earlier. That was something." James chuckled. "Something all right." She hesitated again before speaking. "You didn't seem scared. Not even for a second." James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. When you've seen enough in this world, you learn there's a difference between fear and understanding. He tapped his cane lightly. Fear makes people reckless. Understanding? That's where the real strength is. She let that sit for a moment, then smiled. "I think I get that." James nodded. "Good." The waitress lingered a moment longer, then headed back inside. James watched her go, then let his gaze drift back to the street. The night was calm again, peaceful. He had done what he needed to do. And as he sat there, sipping the last of his cold coffee, he knew one thing for sure: some lessons stay with people forever.